Jeanne-Marie Bouvier de la Motte-Guyon was a French mystic and one of the key advocates of Quietism, although she never called herself a Quietist. Quietism was considered heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, and she was imprisoned from 1695 to 1703 after publishing a book on the topic, A Short and Easy Method of Prayer. Early life and marriage. Guyon was the daughter of Claude Bouvier, a procurator of the Tribunal of Montargis, south of Paris and east of Orléans. Of a sensitive and delicate constitution, she was sickly in her childhood and her education was neglected. Her childhood was spent between the convent and the home of her well-to-do parents, moving 9 times in 10 years. Guyon's parents were very religious people, and they gave her an especially biased training. Other important impressions from her youth that remained with her came from reading the works of Saint Francis de Sales, and from certain nuns, her teachers. Prior to her marriage she had wanted to become a nun, but was denied by her parents. In 1664, when she was 15 years old, after turning down many other proposals, she was forced into an arranged marriage to a wealthy gentleman of Montargis, Jacques Guyon, aged 38. During her 12 years of marriage, Guyon suffered terribly at the hands of her mother-in-law and maidservant. Adding to her misery were the deaths of her half-sister, followed by her mother and her son. Her daughter and father then died within days of each other in July 1672. Guyon continued belief in God's perfect plan and that she would be blessed in suffering. To this end she was, when she bore another son and daughter shortly before her husband's death in 1676. After 12 years of an unhappy marriage, Madame Guyon had become a widow at the age of 28. During her marriage, Guyon became introduced to mysticism by Fr. François Lacombe, a Barnabite, and was instructed by him. Life after marriage. After her husband's death, Madame Guyon initially lived quietly as a wealthy widow in Montargis. In 1679, through circumstances, she re-established contact with François Lacombe, the superior of the Barnabite house in Thonon in Savoy. After a third mystical experience in 1680, Madame Guyon felt herself drawn to Geneva. The Bishop of Geneva, Jean de Renthon-Deleix, persuaded her to use her money to set up a house for New Catholics in Gex, in Savoy, as part of broader plans to convert Protestants in the region. In July 1680, Madame Guyon left Montargis with her young daughter and travelled to Gex. The project was problematic, however, and Madame Guyon clashed with the sisters who were in charge of the house. The Bishop of Geneva sent Father Lacombe to intervene. At this point, Guyon introduced Lacombe to a mysticism of interiority. While her daughter was in an Ursuline convent in Thonon as a pensioner, Madame Guyon continued in Gex, experiencing illness and great difficulties, including opposition from her family. She gave over guardianship of her 2 sons to her mother-in-law and renounced her personal possessions, keeping a sizable annuity for herself. In consequence of the effects her mystical ideas produced, however, the Bishop of Geneva, de Renthon-Deleix, who had at first viewed her coming with satisfaction, asked her to leave his diocese, and at the same time expelled Father Lacombe, who moved to the Bishop of Vercelli. Madame Guyon followed her director to Turin, then returned to France and stayed at Grenoble, where she spread her doctrine more widely with the publication of Moyen Courte Facile de Faire Oraison in January 1685. The Bishop of Grenoble, Cardinal Locamu, was perturbed by the appeal her ideas aroused and she left the city at his request, rejoining Father Lacombe at Vercelli. In July the following year the pair returned to Paris, where Madame Guyon set about to gain adherents for her mystical theories. The timing was ill-chosen. Louis XIV, who had recently been exerting himself to have the Quietism of Molinos condemned at Rome, was by no means pleased to see gaining ground, even in his own capital, a form of mysticism, which to him resembled that of Molinos in many of its aspects. By his order Father Lacombe was shut up in the Bastille, and afterwards in the castles of Oloron and of Lourdes. The arrest of Madame Guyon, delayed by illness, followed on the 29th of January 1688, brought about, she claimed, by Father de la Motte, her brother, and a Barnabite. She was not released until 7 months later, after she had placed in the hands of the theologians who had examined her book a retraction of the propositions which it contained. Some days later she met at Bain, in the Duchess de Bethune-Charost's country house, François Fénelon, who was to be the most famous of her disciples. She won him by her piety and her understanding of the paths of spirituality. Between them there was established a union of piety and of friendship into which no element ever insinuated itself that could possibly be taken to resemble carnal love, even unconscious. Through Fénelon the influence of Madame Guyon penetrated, or was increased in, religious circles powerful at court, among the Beauvilliers, the Chevrieuses, the Montemarts, who were under his spiritual direction, Madame de Maintenon, and through her, the young ladies of St-Cyr, were soon gained over to the new mysticism. This was the height of Madame Guyon's fortune, most of all when Fénelon was appointed on the 18th of August 1688 as the tutor to the Duke of Burgundy, the king's grandson. Before long, however, the Bishop of Chartres, in whose diocese St-Cyr happened to be, took alarm at the spiritual ideas which were spreading there. Warned by him, Madame de Maintenon sought the advice of persons whose piety and prudence recommended them to her, and these advisers were unanimous in the reprobation of Madame Guyon's ideas. Madame Guyon then asked for an examination of her conduct and her writings by civil and ecclesiastical judges. The king consented that her writings should be submitted to the judgment of Bossuet, Louis Antoine, Cardinal d'Hainaut, and of Tronson, superior of the Society of St. Sulpice. After a certain number of secret conferences held at Issy, where Tronson was detained by a sickness, the commissioners presented in 34 articles the principles of Catholic teaching as to spirituality and the interior life. But on the 10th of October 1694, François de Harlay de Champvalen, the Archbishop of Paris, who had been excluded from the conferences at Issy, anticipated the results by condemning the published works of Madame Guyon. She, fearing another arrest, took refuge for some months at Meaux, with the permission of Bossuet, then Bishop of that see. After placing in his hands her signed submission to the 34 articles of Issy, she returned secretly to Paris. At Paris, the police, however, arrested her on the 24th of December 1695 and imprisoned her, first at Vincennes, then in a convent at Voiron, and then in the Bastille, where on the 23rd of August 1699, she again signed a retraction of her theories and an undertaking to refrain from further spreading them. For the time she took no part, personally, in public discussions, but the controversy about her ideas only grew all the more heated between Bossuet and Fénelon. Madame Guyon remained imprisoned in the Bastille until the 21st of March 1703, when she went, after more than 7 years of her final captivity, to live with her son in a village in the diocese of Blois. There she passed them 15 years surrounded by a stream of pilgrims, many from England and Scotland, and spending her time writing volumes of correspondence and poetry. She was also still venerated by the Beauvilliers, the Chevrieuses, and Fénelon, who never failed to communicate with her whenever safe and discreet intermediaries were to be found. Among the pilgrims, my Lord Chelwinkle stayed in Blois with Guyon for 7 years. One visitor, Pierre Poiret, went on to publish many of Guyon's works. One of her greatest works, published in 1717 by Pierre Poiret as Un amante de son Dieu, representait dans les emblemes de Hermanus Hugo sur ses pures desires, features her poetry written to the striking and popular emblem images of the Jesuit Hermann Hugo and the Flemish master Otto von Wien. Guyon herself states that she took these emblems into the Bastille. This poetry appears unabridged and in English for the first time in The Soul Lover of God by Nancy James. Beliefs about prayer. Guyon believed that one should pray all the time, and that in whatever one does, one should be spending time with God. Prayer is the key of perfection and of sovereign happiness. It is the efficacious means of getting rid of all vices and of acquiring all virtues. For the way to become perfect is to live in the presence of God. He tells us this himself, "Walk before me, and be thou perfect." Genesis chapter 17 verse 1. Prayer alone can bring you into His presence, and keep you there continually. As she wrote in one of her poems, there was a period when I chose a time and place for prayer. But now I seek that constant prayer in inward stillness known. Grace versus works. In the Christian dispute regarding grace and works, Guyon defended the belief that salvation is the result of grace rather than works. Like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Calvin, and Martin Luther, she thought that a person's deliverance can only come from God as an outside source, never from within the person himself or herself. Accordingly, God is supposed to decide who is to be saved, regardless of anyone's efforts or industry. He then, as a result of his own free will, bestows his favor as a gift. This predestination was opposed by the Pelagians, who considered it to be irrational in that God would favor a wicked sinner over a good person. However, according to Schopenhauer, if it were works springing from motives and deliberate intention that led to the blissful state, then, however we may turn it, virtue would always be only a prudent, methodical, far-seeing egoism. Works can never justify, because they are always an action from motives. Quote, in her autobiography, for example, Madame Guyon criticized self-righteous people who try to gain heaven through the works. She praised lowly sinners who merely submitted themselves to God's will. Of the righteous, she wrote, the righteous, supported by the great number of works of righteousness he presumes to have done, seems to hold his salvation in his own hands, and regards heaven as the recompense due to his merits. His Savior is, for him, almost useless. These righteous persons expect God to deliver and save them as payment for the good works. In contrast to the self-sufficient righteous egoists, the sinners who have selflessly submitted to God are carried swiftly by the wings of love and confidence into the arms of the Savior, who gives them gratuitously what he has infinitely merited for them. God's bounties are effects of His will, and not the fruits of our merits. Death and influence. In 1704, her works were published in the Netherlands, becoming very popular. Many English and Germans visited her at Blois, among them Johann Wettstein and Lord Forbes. She died at the age of 68 in Blois, believing that she had died submissive to the Catholic Church, from which she had never had any intention of separating herself. Her published works, the Moyen Court and the Regals des Associés à l'Enfance de Quietist, were both placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1688. Fenelon's Maxime des Saints was also branded with the condemnation of both the Pope and the bishops of France. Supplement to the life of Madame Guyon. An 18th-century manuscript, handwritten in French, entitled Supplement to the Life of Madame Guyon, exists in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. This anonymously written manuscript, translated recently by Nancy C. James and placed in an appendix in The Pure Love of Madame Guyon, the supplement sets forth many fresh details about the great conflict which surrounded Madame Guyon. The author of the manuscript provides new insight into Guyon's theology and life. Prison autobiography. Madame Guyon's prison autobiography was thought to have been lost to history, perhaps destroyed by Louis XIV, his agents in the prison hierarchy, or by the Church itself. However, in 1992 Marie-Louise Gondel published the first French edition of the handwritten prison memoirs in Quietist.Quietism. This prison autobiography is now available in English for the very first time in Bastille Witness, the prison autobiography of Madame Guyon, from Nancy C. James, a reliable Guyon scholar, and Sharon Dahlgren-Voros, a professor of French at the U.S. Naval Academy. The autobiography provides fresh insight into Guyon's theology and suffering in her own words. Bibliography. Works vide Madame Guyon, écrite par elle-même. 3 vols, Paris, 1791. The Autobiography of Madame Guyon, T.R. Thomas Taylor Allen, de la Motte-Guyon, Jeanne-Marie Bouvier. Autobiography of Madame Guyon, Chicago, Moody Press. ISBN 9780150106705. OCLC 16978800. Check date values in date equals La Vie de Madame Guyon écrite par elle-même et Benjamin Saller. Opuscules spirituals. 2 vols, Paris, 1790. Les Torrents spirituals. Les Torrents et commentaires au Cantique des Cantiques de Salomon et Claude Morali. Le Moyen Court et Autres Écrits spirituals. Commentaire au Cantique des Cantiques de Salomon. The Song of Songs of Solomon with explanations and reflections having reference to the interior life by Madame Guyon. Trans James W. Metcalf. Les Torrents et commentaires au Cantique des Cantiques de Salomon et Claude Morali. Commentaire sur le livre de Job. Regals des associés à l'enfance de Quietist. Guyon, Jean et Mamanti de Saint-Dieu, representé dans les emblems de Hermanus Hugo sur ses pure desires. Other modern editions. Madame Guyon, Selected Poems of Madame Guyon, ed. Legally, forward by Kelly M. Webb at Toulouse Press, 2012. Selections from the Autobiography of Madame Guyon, ISBN 0879832347. Le Moyen Court et Autres Écrits spirituals, ed. Marie-Louise Gondel. La Passion de Croix, ed. Marie-Louise Gondel. Biographical publications in English. Nancy C. James, The Way of the Child Jesus, ISBN 9780986197109. Nancy C. James, I. Jeanne Guyon, ISBN 9780977780339-2. Nancy C. James, The Soul, Lover of God, ISBN 9780761863337-3. Nancy C. James, Sharon Dahlgren-Voros, Bastille Witness, The Prison Autobiography of Madame Guyon. Nancy C. James, The Complete Madame Guyon, ISBN 9781557259233-3. Nancy C. James, The Pure Love of Madame Guyon, The Great Conflict in King Louis XIV's Court, ISBN 0-7618-37574. Nancy C. James. The Spiritual Teachings of Madame Guyon, including translations into English from her writings. ISBN 0-7734-52893-3. Nancy C. James. The Conflict over the Heresy of Pure Love in 17th-century France. The Tumult over the Mysticism of Madame Guyon. ISBN 0-7734-50092. Cosley, Dorothy. Madame Jeanne Guyon, Child of Another World. ISBN 0875081444. Thomas Cogswell Upham. Life, Religious Opinions and Experience of Madame Guyon. Patricia A. Ward. Madame Guyon, in Carter Lindbergh, ed. The Pietist Theologians. Patricia A. Ward. Experimental Theology in America. Madame Guyon, Fénelon, and the Readers. Jan Johnson. Madame Guyon, Her Autobiography. ISBN 9780979751523. Biographical publications in French. Henry Delacroix, Études sur le mysticisme. Louise Squaria. Madame Guyon, Sa vie, sa doctrine, et son influence. Reviewed by Brunetière. Nouvelles Études critiques. Volume E. Françoise Mallet-Joris. Jeanne Guyon. ISBN 2-08064076-3. Louise Cognet. Crépuscule des Mystiques. Françoise Mallet-Joris. Jeanne Guyon. Pierre Maurice Masson. Fénelon AMME Guyon. Documents nouveaux et inédits. Jean Orsabal. Le Cardinal le Camus témoin précis de Madame Guyon pp. 799-818. Madame Guyon devant ses juges pp. 819-834. Introduction à Jeanne-Marie Bouvier de la Motte-Guyon. Les Opuscules Spirituels pp. 899-910. In Études d'Histoire et de Littérature Religieuse. Madame Guyon. Rencontres Auto de la Vie et l'œuvre de Madame Guyon. Marie-Louise Gondel. Madame Guyon, 1648–1717. Un nouveau visage. ACTE Mystique. Témoignage spirituel de Madame Guyon. These to Doctorate en Théologie. Faculté catholique de Lyon. 1985. Les ANNE Acutes d'éprouves de Madame Guyon. Emprisonnements et interrogatoires sous la loi transgression.